Okay, just now we know the Brazil and China share some similar size in terms of territory and the size of areas, uh, but we also know there's the differences in terms of total population. Uh, so let's look at this figure. This figure shows the GDP measured in current US dollars. You can see actually between the before the middle 1990s and China and Brazil shares very similar size of the total GDP. They have some same trend, but they have a divergent trend after middle 1990s, especially uh, after the late 1990s, especially in the uh, when the time entering the new center, you can see China enjoys a very high speed growth, but the growth rate for the Brazil is very slow, and you can see the gap in terms of total GDP becomes larger and larger. Nowadays, you know China has become the second largest economy in the world, follow the United States. And in the 2020, you can see the total GDP of China has arrived at 14.7 trillion US dollars, but Brazil just 1.445 trillion. So Brazil now just accounts for the 9.8% of China's total GDP. So I think this is very big gap for these two countries in terms of GDP. So let's look at another figure in terms of the GDP per capita measured in current US dollars. So you can see because China has a large population, so when you divide by when you use the GDP divided by the total population, the number will be very low. So you can see actually during the last 60 years, and the GDP per capita of the Brazil always high than China in the 50 years before the 2008. You can see the green line is Brazil of the high, and also after the 2000 there also a dramatic increase in terms of GDP per capita in Brazil. And also China also have an increasing trend during the last 20 years. But for Brazil, it's a better news that since 2008, you can see the GDP per capita decreasing year by year. So, so in the 2020, you can see that China's GDP per capita is 10,000 more than 10,000 US dollars, and but the Brazil the GDP per capita has decreased to the 6,797 US dollars. Okay, so you can see the highest GDP per capita for Brazil is in the 2011. So you can see 2011. So I think you maybe know much about than me to why the Brazil's GDP per capita goes down during the decade, the last decade. Okay, maybe due to the collapse of the resource, or maybe due to the instability of political system, or maybe due to the currency of the real. Okay, so I think there's a lot of story. Maybe you can dig further to understand why Brazil goes down, and then you can find a big gap the gap is also increased in terms of GDP between China and Brazil. Okay. So also from the studies, there's a lot of literature discussing the middle income trap, because both China and Brazil belongs to the middle income countries. There's a lot of studies to look at a lot of developing countries will follow, whether this country will fall into the middle income trap. So also in this year's China also struggled to some a new normal growth rate, to look at whether China's economy will upgrade to a high level of high income countries. So this is very important for China and Brazil. Okay, so so I think in the following 10 years or 10 years or 20 years, I think is very critical period for China and Brazil. For the Brazil, you can see whether the government can turn around the decreasing trend of GDP per capita, because GDP per capita will have close relation to the welfare of the people. So I think this is a very important story, and also you pay much attention to this trend. Okay. So this figure shows the growth rate for China and Brazil. So you can see due to the last 2 decades, 20 years, you can see China always enjoys a high GDP growth rate than Brazil. And especially after China's entry into WTO, the GDP growth always keeping higher than 8%. But nowadays you can see the growth rate of China also decrease a lot. So then less than 7 or even 6% rate. And you can see both China and Brazil suffering the pandemic impact. So you can see China's growth rate goes down to the less than 4%, and the Brazil goes down to become negative. Okay, so in this special period, I think both countries need to have a lot of things to do to how to keep a favorable growth rate to keep the economic growth. Okay, so let's look at another feature. In the following 3 or 4 slides, I will show you the economic structure of Brazil and China. So this figure shows the industrial share of the value added in GDP. You can see between, I think, before the 1990s, and both China and Brazil have a large share of industry in the GDP. But after 1990s, you can see there's a divergent trend, and China still keep a very large share of the industry value added, about between the 30 and 40%. But the share of the industry of the Brazil goes down quickly after 1990s, so still have a decreasing trend. You can see the share of industry in the GDP has goes down to the, I think, about maybe 15 or 16 trend. So you can see there's a bigger gap between China and Brazil in the industry. So we also know China has become the world factory, and also has a complete production chains or lines in China. But you can find that Brazil have a very small share of industry. Maybe the agriculture and the service have a large share. So let's look at another figure. So this shows that the agriculture and the forest and the fishing value added of GDP. So you can see both China and Brazil have a decreasing trend of the agriculture sector in the GDP. And in 2020, China just have the 7.6%, and the Brazil has 5.9% of agriculture. So according to this, so you can see both of these countries have a decreasing trend of agriculture, and the agriculture sector plays a smaller role in the GDP. So following these two slides, we can find the service sector of the GDP. So due to the small share of the agriculture and the industry, you can see Brazil have a larger share of the service in the GDP. So you can see due to the last 60 years, Brazil always has a large share of the service in the GDP, and China, but you can see China always has a low share of the service, but you can see due to the last 30 years, China has increasing share of the service. Nowadays, China also the share of the service also surpass the industry and plays a big role. But relative to compared with Brazil, you can see there's still have a 10% gap. So here we will ask questions whether the different industrial structure result in the different growth rate. I think maybe you can try to answer these questions after this course to see whether a developing countries has a large share of service will have a slow growth rate, or developing countries need to develop its industry to keep a high growth rate. So whether the industry structure will determine the growth rate. So I think this is very important questions. So you can see both China and Brazil have different industry structure. Then they also have a different growth rate, right? So let's look at the trade and FDI. So you can see this figure shows the total exports of goods for China and Brazil. You can see in the last century, since the 1970s to the 2000, you can see China and Brazil have very similar size in terms of goods exports. But after entering the new center, because China entering the WTO in 2001, so you can see when China entering the WTO, the export increase at a dramatical rate. Okay, so nowadays you can see China has become the largest exporters of manufacturing goods. But for Brazil, the total export rate is very stable. So you can see the big difference between China and Brazil. So this is exports of goods and service. This is so when we add the service together, you can see the same trend. Okay, so there's no big difference between these two countries.